Recently, I talked a little bit about Doom Orb in my top 5 best items of Season 6. But due to the time restrictions of the video itself, because I had to talk about a lot of other items as well, I couldn't go as in-depth as I would have liked to. And that's what we're doing today. Today we're only looking at Doom Orb, or rather the combination that Doom Orb is currently being built in, and how Doom Orb really changed up the meta almost by itself. I think the story of Doom Orb is a really fascinating one that would maybe have a little bit more attention if it was about a god and not an item, so I want to shine a little bit of a light on this one and give this item a little bit of the highlight that it deserves after how it's really changed everything this year. So the 3 fields that we'll look at are the changes to Doom Orb, or the history of Doom Orb, then the meta changes, and also the item stat changes and how it works in comparison to other starts. Doom Orb existed in the game for a long time, but the current version was really introduced at the start of Season 6. Before that, it had some different iterations that don't really matter in the context of how it is utilized now, so we don't really need to look at that. The relevant one for us is the version that exists now that has Lost Artifact as a tier 1, Cursed Orb as the tier 2, and then Doom Orb as a tier 3. When it was introduced, it had somewhat similar stats to now, but not quite as good. Many of the stats on the item weren't changed. The mana, the MP5, and the movement speed weren't touched at all. But originally it had 135 magical power, and the price was 3,200 gold, which felt overly expensive at the time, to be honest, especially because all other high power items were cheaper. Over time, the item received some adjustments that made it more accessible. The price was decreased to 3,000 gold, but generally speaking, Doom Orb remained a niche item. The god that primarily made use of it was Habois when played in the jungle and needed that mobility increase, which wasn't even always the case. It wasn't played on him in every game either. Most other jungles weren't magical, and those that were not necessarily dependent on an item that worked the way that Doom Orb did. Think for example Ao Kuang. Hi-Rez recognized this issue and tackled Doom Orb once again in the mid-season patch. The explanation was as follows. Doom Orb recently received a buff, but it failed to address a core concern. When properly managing the stacks, this item becomes very potent. The downside of losing the stacks is too great. When many late game fights occur around objectives and away from minions to restack this effect, it can become a liability. We're shifting some of the power away from the stacks and onto the base item to make it more consistent while still allowing players to min-max its effect in lane. Reduce magical power per stack from 6 to 4, increase the base magical power from 135 to 145, which means at full stacks you'd have the same power as before, but 10 more base. After that, Doom Orb got a little attention. Not massively, just a little bit more in the beginning. And interesting enough, I would argue that nowadays it could be possible, not 100% sure of it, but it could be possible that even if this Doom Orb change didn't happen, we would have ended up with the same result where Doom Orb becomes as popular as it is now. Because Doom Orb was no longer looked at as a jungler item. It was looked at as a new option for mid, a mobility option. This became especially interesting in the context of other changes to the game, because around August, the Persephone patch came out where a variety of movement speed items was actually nerfed, meaning that movement speed in many ways wasn't as accessible and more of a luxury stat. Now around the same time, mages had started facing another issue. Their typical starts were either revolving around Book of Thoth tier 2 or around Mage's Blessing plus some additional item. And both of these starts led to them struggling very much with the meta that was going on when played in middle lane. The meta became more and more aggressive with a heavy focus on invades and more hunters pushed into middle lane, which had access to other starts, like for example starting the game with Hunter's Blessing, which provide them with a decent amount of base MP5, or with just tier 2 Transcendence, or with Mage's Blessing plus tier 1 Transcendence, and all of these options allowed them to bully mages quite well, especially in combination with their often high base damage values in the first place. Now, it wasn't all hunters that pushed into mid, but specifically mostly ability-based hunters that were really built around this pressure. And no matter what mages tried, their build path just didn't keep up. The items they used often came with less MP5, sometimes required longer to get online, and sometimes were also more expensive. They needed a safer place to farm, which they found in duo lane instead. And that was okay, but of course was not ideal. And that is where Doom Orb came in. In order to understand what exactly happened here, we need to look into some item combinations that were frequently used at the time. There were more combinations, like for example using Mage's Blessing and Tiny Trinket as well, but I want to focus on the ones that actually have similar stats that can be compared, because if we're looking at items that come with health and everything, it's going to be a very different conversation. And these builds were not used by the majority of mages anyways, so it's a different conversation. So the stats that we primarily saw were Mage's Blessing plus Magic Focus, which would then be built either into Spear of the Magus or Spear of Desolation. Not really important here in this context which one was used, but both were used. Mage's Blessing and Lost Artifact, the tier 1 of Doom Orb or of Rod of Tahuti, for example, or Chronos Pendant. Or tier 2 Book of Thoth being Book of Souls. So what stats did these items have? The Spear Start came with 45 power, with 10 bonus damage per ability as every Mage's Blessing start. 2 or more MP5, completely dependent on how much mana you lost. That's just how it works with Mage's Blessing. And 10% cooldown reduction when Mage's Blessing was maxed. The price for all of that was 1,350 gold. With Lost Artifact, we'd have a total of 40 power, also 10 bonus damage, 7 MP5 or more, because this is the 5 MP5 of Lost Artifact plus the Mage's Blessing MP5, and then again 10% cooldown reduction when Mage's Blessing was maxed, all for 1,250 gold. And then the Book of Thoth option would simply come with 55 power, so a little bit more early aggression in that regard, and 125 mana, which could kind of offset the lack of MP5, for 1,350 gold. Now, the advantage of the Book of Souls start is, of course, that you're skipping the starter item, you're skipping any kind of wasted money in that sense. At the same time, I always thought that Mage's Blessing itself was a pretty nice starter item due to the cooldown reduction. So it was kind of a tough choice, and neither was ideal really. I personally always disliked the Book of Souls start just because I really like having some MP5, and I also like early cooldown reduction. Enter Doom Orb, or rather enter the build that Doom Orb is utilized in. Because this build consists not only of Doom Orb, it consists of Shoes of Focus and Doom Orb. And what you're starting with are your tier 2 boots, the magic shoes, plus Lost Artifact, the tier 1 of Doom Orb. This build initially comes with 40 power, plus 5 MP5, 12% movement speed, and cost 1,450 gold. So comparing it to the others, we'll have a slight loss in power between 0 to 15 really, and we don't have the bonus damage per ability that Mage's Blessing has with 10 extra damage. I would say that is an acceptable loss. We get 5 MP5, which is really a significant enough value, and I like it a little bit more than the conditional MP5 of Mage's Blessing, though that is of course subjective. And you also get 12% movement speed at this point already. Movement speed, again in an invade heavy meta, is very, very valuable, and also allows you to rotate more and avoid abilities better, so there's really no downside to having it. And especially with the more frequent backing in early game, it can be very valuable for that as well. But now what's more important is what comes afterwards, and that's the next upgrade. Now of course, with any of the other builds, you could just upgrade into boots afterwards. But you would be upgrading into tier 1 shoes for 500 gold, which only give you 6% extra movement speed. And you need to understand that if you upgrade from tier 2 boots to tier 3 boots, you get a whole set of other different stats, and you also get 6% movement speed. So every other upgrade is going to lose out against Shoes of Focus in that regard. So we can only really look at other item upgrades for the items that we're already building, because otherwise Shoes of Focus will win every comparison. Additionally, we should also keep in mind that it's guaranteed that the one building shoes of any kind here is the one who's getting back to lane faster. You cannot possibly get back to lane faster than the person that is building Shoes of Focus if you only have as much gold as they have at this point and you started not building boots. So let's pull up our next upgrade options on the big screen. If we're looking to build Mage's Blessing and the tier 1 of Spear, then the next upgrade to the tier 2 of Spear is 750 gold, which is still within reason. A total power after building this would only increase by 5 to 50, and still the 10 bonus damage. We'd still have 2 or more MP5 just based on Mage's Blessing, and the cooldown reduction of Mage's Blessing when maxed on 10%. Other than that, we get 10 flat penetration. So we get a little bit of nice bonus damage, but nothing all too extreme. The price to upgrade Lost Artifacts, if we go on the Doom Orb route, is 1050 gold. A lot more expensive already. We get 75 power of that, 10 bonus damage still, and 17 MP5, so we have a lot of that at this point. This is nice if MP5 is your absolute focus at this point already. CDR again only when you max out Mage's Blessing, and you get 3% movement speed, plus 75 mana as well on the side. You also get the Cursed Orb passive, which can increase your movement speed up to 15% and up to 15 extra power. But that's the conditional bonus. With Book of Thoth, our upgrade is 1300 gold, and we get roughly 95 power by the time we can build that, depending on the circumstances, how much mana you have, what level you are, what god you're playing. We also get 15 MP5, still no cooldown reduction, no movement speed, and 250 mana on the side. And now let's look at what happens if we upgrade the boots to Shoes of Focus instead. Our upgrade is cheaper than anything else here, 650 gold. The power increase is 75, so slightly behind Book of Thoth or Lost Artifact tier 2 here, because that gets a little of extra damage here and there, but again, not far behind. You get 5 MP5, which honestly is sufficient until you build your next item in my opinion. You get 10% cooldown reduction right away, not when anything's maxed, which will greatly increase your damage over a little bit more power in my opinion, at least in most situations. And you will get 18% movement speed. Every rotation to every camp, every invade, everything will be faster. You have a much higher chance of surviving a gank and everything else, so it feels a lot better. And if we really want to compare it to a much more expensive item like Book of Thoth, then we could also look at the next upgrade for Lost Artifact at this point, and then we'd look at Cursed Orb, which would be another 35 base power for 400 gold more, plus all the extra stats that you get as well. So really, in terms of power curve, there's only a very brief spike for Book of Thoth. And to understand how great Cursed Orb is as an upgrade at the moment, we can compare it to the other items in the tree. Because Restored Artifact, the other tier 2, comes with 50 magical power and 15 MP5. Cursed Orb comes with 55 magical power and 15 MP5 as well, but also gets 75 extra mana, 3% extra movement speed, and the entire passive with the movement speed and power on top of that. So it is completely better stat-wise for the exact same price. Now you may be wondering, why are we building cooldown boots here and not pen boots? Well, first of all, they are a little bit cheaper, which can be quite deciding when you can back one wave earlier, for example, but that's just depending on the situation, really, depending on what fights are happening anyways. But not only would I personally argue that on most cards Shoes of Focus are simply more effective, I prefer them just because they have the same power now and they have so much more extra, but they also ensure that you're not losing out on the CDR that anyone with Mage's Blessing will have. And the mages that are typically ran with this build right now are mages that go into Spear of the Magus unless they need Divine Ruin right after that. So they get more than enough pen from that anyways. And because we're not using a starter item, but rather utilizing Lost Artifact like a starter item that provides us with the extra power and MP5 that we need at the start, we essentially kind of save a little bit on Doom Orb, because the price that we have to pay at this point is only 2,400 gold, making it much more bearable in comparison to other items that you would build at that point. Sure, others will have their tier 1 item as well that they can work with, but in that case they still have to finish their full boot, so they're gonna lose out either way. Meanwhile, the potential to out-rotate your enemies while still keeping up with them in damage and in cooldown reduction and in MP5 means that in terms of itemization, you're building the most ideal path that you can reach at the moment on most mages. After you've built the flat pen item of your choice, your build becomes very flexible as well. You can go into something like Ethereal, you can go into Soul Reaver, Chronos Pendant, Obsidian Shard, Rod of Tahuti, whatever you want, so you're not bound to anything. I think this is very interesting, and I wonder if Hi-Rez intends to change that, or if they want to have this start going for a while. I could imagine that Cursed Orb may get some nerfs because it is a bit overwhelming stat-wise, but we'll see about that. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, so you can stay updated on upcoming videos. Tomorrow we will most likely be talking about a rising star, so stay tuned for that. And with that, thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you all for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth,